Well, it's fun to be back. By the way, that last presentation, I think the speaker's gone, but that was one of the most impressive things I've seen at a space access in a long time. Nice job. So I'll be far less impressive because what I'm going to do is reprise something that I talked about in 2012, which is gravity. I thought I tried to come up with some clever titles for this presentation, but this was about the best I could do. Gravity is a massive problem. It's some serious, well, it's basically a problem that we cannot solve by going to planetary surfaces, and I'm going to speak to that in a little bit more detail. By the way, if you look carefully at this photograph, you actually see the astronaut in the image is leaping into the air. He's about 2.5 feet or so above the lunar surface. I invite anybody to try that in the room if you like. Just stand up and just jump vertically and see how far you can go. So this is a demonstration of what we face as we go into the smaller planets and moons of the solar system. So down there. So Joe Carroll and John Goff both used this slide in the past, and I used it in 2012 to illustrate the problem. This is where we have all of our experience, and this is where we have all of our experience. At lunar gravity, we have about, a few man-days of experience over all the 12 astronauts who've walked on the lunar surface. So we don't know what the shape of this curve is. Is it something where a very small amount of gravity gets you back to 80–90% of that which is necessary for permanent human habitation of space? Is it something where you spend 2 years on the moon and you die because your muscles actually snap your bones? The muscle tension still pulls on your bone, but osteoporosis destroys your bone. And sooner or later, it just fails. Is it a linear relationship? We have no idea of the shape of this curve. And so the reason Space Studies Institute is suggesting the need, the demand for a gravity lab to answer this question is that we've spent $500 billion in 50 years, half a century of the space age, and we have not answered this question. From my perspective, what have the space agencies of the world been doing? Because obviously they're not interested in permanent human habitation. Yet the US National Space Policy talks about indefinite, i.e. permanent human habitation of space. So NASA doesn't appear to be interested in this. Their focus is, 9 months of zero-G going to Mars and spending a short while on the surface and then returning. That's the total sum of their interest in the question. This is obviously unacceptable. And I'll talk a little bit later about what NASA has tried to do in the past with international partners on ISS and has failed to do. But the biological community in the United States, in the decadal survey on biological and physical sciences in 2011, said specifically, this is a priority, it should be funded. And it obviously is not being funded and won't be funded in the future. That's pretty clear to us. So various entrepreneurs, who will remain nameless, have talked about us becoming a multiplanetary species. And I'm all for this, obviously. I've been doing this for 45 years. But this is the palette on which we can paint in the solar system. This is taking all the minor planetoids, moons, etc., out, Also the ones at Jupiter that are in radiation environments that are simply inhospitable to any future form of human life without Star Trek-like shields. And you'll notice that all the bodies, you've got a cluster of 4 bodies here, the Moon, Titan, Ganymede, and Callisto, that are essentially all the same G-force, about 1/6 G. Mercury and Mars are the same, though Mercury is so far down into the solar gravity well that it's an unlikely target for human settlement. An interesting option is Venus, because it's 90% of Earth G, and in fact, an even more interesting option in some respects is Saturn, because it's 106%, and I'll mention that in a second. But if this is your target, and it is the professed target of a lot of people, with some of whom actually have real money and have real plans to go there and talk about putting permanent human settlements on these planets. We can look at all of the other issues, radiation, thermal, even being at the bottom of the gravity well. We have the technology to solve each and every one of those issues but one, and that is gravity. Okay. Modifying gravity on a planetary surface can be done only by putting an angled centrifuge on the surface. And I argue, and I think it's SSI's position, it was Jerry O'Neill's position, that the bottom of gravity well is not the place for an expanding technological civilization. So this is just a one-slide diversion that talks about surviving at 1G environments, either at Venus or at Saturn. Now, I don't know about you, but there's a certain degree of low-grade airplane fear that would attend to living in an environment like this. Because especially it really doesn't matter, you're dead in both environments if the balloon fails. But that's a long way down for Saturn. And it's a really ugly death on Venus because of sulfuric acid clouds and 900 degree Fahrenheit surface temperatures. So this would be like living in an airplane continuously in flight. And I think while that's interesting as a scientific experiment, it probably doesn't make much sense as a home. So I alluded to the fact that you really don't want to get to the bottom of a gravity well. So, you don't want to be here, here, or here. Where you want to be is here, in the libration points of the Earth-Moon system, or elsewhere in the solar system. So, to my mind, this is what we would like. Space settlements, 5, 10, 15,000, 100,000 people, rotating, providing 1G, 1 atmosphere, a pleasant living environment. And I think these are far more technically feasible today than they were in O'Neill's day. And the main reason, I think, is these go away. Windows are no longer necessary. You would use LED screens, and you could simulate. You take out the rotation electro-optically, and you could simulate whatever terrestrial environment you want, or any environment for that matter. So I wouldn't mind living here. I'd settle for this. This is Space Station 5 from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's not quite as salubrious an internal environment, but it certainly would be a huge step forward. Now, I'm not done. This is what we can afford. And of course, this is von Braun in front of the Disney XS-1 space station model in around 1955. This TV program, by the way, is what got me started on my career. We can afford the model. And that's the crux of the problem I'm going to talk about. By the way, for those of you who don't know, that's a slide rule. It's a pair of wooden sticks that you use to calculate things. I wish I still had mine from like 1968, but I was never.
Have mine.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just a humorous aside. So some people after my 2012 talk came up to me, and they can remain nameless, so I won't embarrass them, and said, obviously it's too ambitious a project. I mean, you're talking about a multi-$100 million free-flying space station. Why not do something smaller? You know, why not build a little capsule that flies on a Falcon 1, something like that? And that's basically what the NanoRacks Astrium centrifuge, which is on ISS right now, can do for you. It deals with worms, the C. elegans worm model. It could probably also handle Drosophila, the fruit fly. Neither of those critters have backbones. And I'm only interested in multi-generational vertebrate research, and I'll point that out in a sec. Now, the Japanese government, NASDA, now JAXA, developed at their own expense a centrifuge module which was supposed to fly on ISS in the mid-2000s. Ultimately, it was built. It's sitting at Tsukuba in the Japanese Science City in a parking lot. It will never fly, and I'll explain why in a sec. But this was a 2.4 meter diameter centrifuge, which would be suitable for mice and rats. And then various organizations within NASA, JSC principally, have looked at like the Nautilus X concept, a large inflatable that could be attached to ISS. None of these are going to happen or work. This, as I've said, is too small. This is too disruptive to ISS. And the reason is that is a momentum wheel. Okay? And ISS, you spin this and you mess with it, and ISS follows this. All right. This makes the microgravity people really seriously unhappy. And they have a much, much bigger say with respect to ISS operations than any of the biologists. And consequently, this didn't happen even after it was built and ready to fly. And this is just more of the same as a magnified problem. So we really do need a dedicated free flyer. It has to be big. It has to handle multi-generational experimentation on animals. In other words, you want 3, 4, 5, 6 generations of mice born and raised at the G level of interest. You really need to do it at 1/3 G, i.e. Mars, 38%. You need to do it at lunar G, and you need a control at 1 G. So that's 3 or 4 centrifuges. You also need graduate students to work on it. All right. So now you need the ability to support humans, even in a zero-gravity station, and fly them out like every 4 months, just like we do at ISS. So our proposal in 2012 was to co-locate co-orbitally with ISS in trail, 10 or 20 kilometers behind. And the simple reason for doing that is, I think, kind of obvious to everyone in this room, and that is if you're launching crew to ISS under CCDEV or one of the NASA programs, what happens is once you get to ISS, the delta V to go to a core orbital station is microscopic. It's a few meters per second. So you can stop at that station before or after. You could basically make one trip, serve 2 visits. And that is, I think, the only economical way to operate the crew part of the system to make this feasible. Now, this is not a small structure. This is about 5 meters in diameter and about the length of Skylab, but only about half the weight because it doesn't have a lot of the extraneous stuff that Skylab had in it. So I'm sure you can't read any of these details, but we will post this on the SSI website next week, and you'll be able to download it if you like. But basically, what this is just a 5-meter diameter aluminum can. It could be composite as well, with an airlock at the top. Power and service systems for solar arrays, which would deploy up here. A habitation deck that your 4 crew persons would live in, a commons level that they could take their meals and so forth, and then a lab deck with two centrifuges. And these need to be dual just to preserve its motion in inertial space. I mean, you don't want to start tumbling your station and so forth. And then a storage level and a docking level, which also would serve as storage. And then an actual trash bag here, which doubles as it can be a temporary storage, and it could be detached and deorbited as necessary. And that's basically like the LOX tank that was used on Skylab to hold trash. And that's a single Falcon launch, so it's about 100,000 pounds and about $100 million for the launch. But recently I got to thinking about something that was even a little bit more ambitious. Now it turns out the cost of the station components, even though there are going to be two launches, doesn't go up that much. The engineering doesn't change to a large degree for this particular second concept. But the launch cost does double, obviously. On the other hand, Falcon Heavy reusable would also have a reduced launch cost, and that appears to be on track, say, sometime in the next 5 or 6 years. So by the time a station like this was built, or the components were built, the launch cost for this dual launch option might be about the same as what we're looking at for a single launch. And so what this proposal is to fly two launches, one with a couple of storage decks, one with your hab and comment decks, and then with a Moon G-Lab and a Mars G-Lab, and the storage deck can serve as your 1G control. And then you have stowed masts, either between the G-Labs or along the entire length here. And these could be inflatable, they could be truss deployed, astromast type things. There's a number of different solutions. So what you do is you do 2 launches, perhaps 30 days apart. They rendezvous on orbit, and this can all be done without a human crew. The human crew visits after the docking and spin-up. They rendezvous, they dock, and then extend their masts and spin up. This is about a 300-foot, call it 100, 110, 120 meters at 4 RPM. Now, 4 RPM is probably right at the edge of acceptable spin rates for easy adaptation. We don't really know. There have been various experiments on the ground, but of course 1G on the ground confounds all of your testing. So we would have to do a little bit of experimentation on orbit probably to confirm this. But 4G is probably, 4 RPM is probably acceptable. Anyway, this system would be the first true 1G rotating space station. And I think for that reason alone, a donor who wants to have their name on probably the most significant in-space construction that the human race has yet attempted might be well served to look at this option rather than a more conventional free flyer. So that brings me to the end of the talk. I know the first question is going to be, is there any money to do this? And the answer is no. Nobody seems to be interested. So I'm probably going to bore you year in and year out by coming back here and living up to my middle name, which is Charles, not Cassandra. But I'm going to keep on beating on this community until somebody raises their hand and says, I'm a Russian oligarch and I want to fund this, or I'm a, or I am, whatever. I'm Larry Page or Sergey Brin, and I want to put my name on such a construction. So
I'm going to exercise conference manager's prerogative and make the first comment. And Gary, this probably isn't your preferred method of funding it, but somehow this really needs to be done. It is Space Access Society policy that this is the general sort of thing that NASA should be funding. It is also Space Access Society policy that it's the sort of thing NASA should be funding on a public-private cooperative COTS type model, so it actually gets done in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable amount of money. The details of implementation will have to wait till after the conference. Okay, Tim, whoever you've got first up for questions, who's got the mic?
yes.
I was at a conference in Houston in February where a representative of Boeing was there talking about their proposed plan to Mars. I brought this very thing up saying if it turns out that human health requires this, is there flexibility in your plan for it? There is not. They're putting all their eggs into Kelly living on the station for a year, and they're learning enough about it.
Right.
And apparently everyone's doing that.
That is what we found. We've attended a number of conferences, even of the biologists who have bent their pick on trying to do this at much smaller scale for literally decades, and have never succeeded and won't succeed with that attitude, which is the NASA policy. Nothing I can do about that. Now, to Henry's point about a public-private partnership, when I first talked about this, I mean, there's one thing, how much money does it cost to build the hardware? Okay, maybe it's a few $100 million. How much money does it cost to launch it? Then maybe it's, again, 100 million, maybe 200 million. I propose that if SSI could get a donor to allow us to design and build and ground test the test article, at that point, some country would step up. Might not be this one, but some country would step up, Japan, Europe, Scandinavian countries, Brazil, somebody, and say, we'll pay for the launch. And then at that point, I assume that NASA will be so shamed into action that they might pay for the continuing operation or part of the continuing operation. This is a little bit like building these big telescopes, like the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. That's a $400 million project. The first $40 million came from Charles Shimoni and Bill Gates. All right, but they're not paying for the operation or even the whole thing. So there has to be pretty much a public-private partnership.
I noticed you mentioned.
Sorry, you're jumping the queue. When you get the mic, there's always somebody ahead of you.
Who?
Use the mics.
I do. Hi, I'm a graduate student, but an engineer, not a biologist. My first thought for the standalone version was why make it human capable? Why not do that automated robotic arm type thing?
In a prior career, I actually worked with mice in a lab. Now, this was 4.5 decades, 5 decades ago. It's really, really, really hard to automate that. Now, recently, people have started working on exactly this sort of thing, and I think you could potentially reduce the crew. You might get down to 2 or something. I do not think you can close the loop and have none. I really don't think that works. Now, it might be possible to have ISS crewmen transit over, as a man-tended or human-tended platform on, every week or something. And they're there to do repair or whatever, and that's a perfectly valuable and viable approach to consider in the trade space. We just haven't, we haven't even got the money to build the model, let alone do the trades. Who's next?
So in Jeff's talk just now, he talked about the years when he had no money were the ones where he made the most technical progress, and you've had a good 3 years now with no money, so have you made a lot of technical progress?
Fair. Very fair, but there's zero money and there's no money. So as you know, all of the people who work at SSI are volunteers, and we have other day jobs. And consequently, we can devote maybe 3% of our time to thinking about this. And most of that 3% has been trying to knock on doors to see if we could get, say, $2 million to put together a design team and start contracting with people to do work. I mean, we won't necessarily do everything in-house because we don't have the resources at this point to do it. But I like to think that this step of a deployable mast approach is the progress we made. Of course, at that rate, it will be 2022 or something like that before, or no, I'm sorry, it'll be like 2,222 before this thing flies.
Yeah. One of the most critical aspects of this is how long you really need to make it in order to get the spin rate down low enough. I suggest that the best way to do that is presuming that the Falcon, that the Dragon does get man-rated as now generally expected,
Right.
and in a time frame that's probably comparable to that where we know that the Kelly brothers, the one that's staying up for a year, is having problems and that the current marching direction is marching towards a cliff. I think it may be very timely to consider how to do a Gemini-like spinning test using a Dragon on the way to station, using the Falcon spent stage as the ballast mast. We don't need to rendezvous with an Agena. Mm-hmm. And the key person to get interested in this is Elon Musk personally. Not just because he has the money, but because he has the credibility among the other billionaires to say, yeah, we need to do this. And we'll do it on my hardware, we'll do it on the way to space station. The mods cost is trivial compared to the launch cost of even this. And we can find out the key thing we need to know, which is the tolerable spin rate. Mm-hmm. And the ground test, according to John Charles was the one of JSC alerted me to this problem. You can't make any conclusions from the ground tests.
Correct.
Other than that you need to do tests other than on the ground.
Right.
So, Joe, is there a question there?
So I very specifically, as you know, Joe, I agree with that as an intermediate goal. I very specifically asked Elon to support this, and he very specifically said it's not a priority for him. Okay, so
There's
I
a
would focus on Mars gravity.
there's a bandwidth problem there. Elon doesn't have a lot to spare.
well, also we won't get into reasons why that may be the case, but increasingly, I think that he has a very singular focus on Mars. He has adopted the NASA view that gravity is not a problem. And there will be a reckoning, I believe, for that. And the problem is trying to change Elon's mind is, I'll leave it at that.
Anybody who's easy to persuade to change their mind isn't going to go that far in this business anyway. Gary, if I could attempt to wrap this up for you, because we're running a little bit late. Correct me if I'm wrong, but your ideal would be private funding working directly with SSI as far as being the most efficient way to get it done quickest, but that's in the hundreds of millions at least. Would I be correct in saying that money well short of that to SSI would you get a running start on putting things together to get ready for larger amounts of funding?
Of course, and
That Space Studies Institute, Gary Hudson, president.
so SSI's, I believe, posted a plan. It was just a few pages long, but it did have a schedule concept and a breakdown in phase A, phase B, phase C type approach, of course. And we started with, $2 million to do requirements of design study over, say, a 6 to 8 month period, and then $20 million to start building test hardware and components and getting facilities put in place, and then the balance of about $200 million to actually build a flight test article. So you obviously aren't going to get someone to sign up to $200 million, and you're also not going to do it all in-house. SSI would be the program manager, but we would be subcontracting with the appropriate firms to do this work.
It's not exactly pocket change, but the money to get this this is an important project, and the money to get it rolling is well short of the national budget area or the billionaire area. Anyway, Gary, I apologize for cutting this short. We're running a little bit late. Gary will be around for a little bit, is that correct?
Yeah.
So you can talk to him afterwards. Meantime, we're going to break. At this point, we're going to try to get back together in about 20 minutes, about 10 minutes after 11, and carry on with the program. I'll see you all then.